format is I'm going to spend about 20 minutes, 30 minutes talking to Jeremy, asking him a whole bunch of questions. Then we're going to open it up for Q&A. The way that we do that is just in the chat, just say, hey, I've got a question. You don't have to put your question in there. Kathy will tee you up and you can ask your question directly to Jeremy Utley. So I am incredibly honored to have Jeremy join us today. So Jeremy is the author of Idea Flow, an incredible book. He's the head of Stanford's famous D School. He's one of the world's leading experts on innovation. He is the general partner at Freespin Capital, and he's the co-host of Stanford's Masters of Creativity, which is a wildly popular series. So we are unbelievably blessed to have him. And before we start talking, Kathy, get us started. Mike Perlow, I see you in one of those little squares there. Mike Perlow's company, Perlow Productions, put that intro together. Thank you very much. Jeremy,
wow,
I am fired up to have you here.
I'm ready to charge the field. Let's go.
Right?
Let's do this.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Heather Monahan says hello. I saw Heather Thursday night in Miami.
Nice.
And she absolutely was raving about you on her podcast. So
we had a great, what's always challenging about conversations like that is you realize 30 minutes in, we should be recording this part.
Yeah, right.
You know, because we had like the pre-podcast conversation. We go, this is actually the interesting stuff. Can we try to redo that now?
Right,
you know,
exactly.
You can never recapture it. So I think the way you're doing this is brilliant.
A lot of the magic happens. Listen, I am beyond honored to have you join us today because I love this topic. I love the topic of innovation. You know, my company's won 8 consecutive American Business Awards for innovation. And to me, it's what gets me popping out of bed every day. So we're going to jump right in. You call your book, and this is a bold statement, the only business metrics that matters, Idea Flow. Yeah. Tell me why the bold statement.
Well, very simply, Idea Flow is a measure of solutions you can generate to a problem at any time, right? Over time, basically. And if you know, as I do as a nerd, that empirically speaking, the single greatest predictor of the quality of your solutions is actually the quantity of your solutions, then it stands to reason that what you need to be measuring is actually how many solutions you can generate against any problem at any time. And not only is it the only business metric that truly matters because it's the only predictor of future success, sadly, it's one of the most important metrics nobody's measuring. Very few people have any data around their ability to generate novel solutions. They may have data on their innovation pipeline, but as I go into organizations, even the most robustly instrumented organizations in regards to innovation, they start with all the good ideas that we're sorting through. And to me, if your data management system only includes all the good ideas, then you may be managing innovation, you're not cultivating innovation, and you're certainly not practicing innovation. And ultimately, unless you're cultivating an innovative mindset and practicing innovation, whatever you got in the pipeline is going to push through. And then the question is, what's next?
Yep.
And in a lot of cases, as my friend Philippe Barreau, who runs the innovation lab at Michelin, says, a lot of times, an executive brings $1 billion Post-it to the innovation lab, and the lab does a really great job of empirically proving we should not invest in that idea. And they're deeply thankful. But he said, the problem is that was the only Post-it they have.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what happens is the big idea turns out to not be that big, but we don't really have a robust practice for generating lots of ideas. And so we go, oh no, what do we do now that we realize that the big idea is not really going to work? And that's why we believe idea flow, a practice of routinely generating novel solutions, is actually the answer to tomorrow's profits and tomorrow's problems.
I think cultivating that mindset of innovation is such an interesting thing to talk about. And I think we all know, like, brainstorming 101 is that you throw as much stuff up on the whiteboard and you don't critique and all that. I think we've all heard that a million times, yet we're like, nah, that won't work. We can't put that up there. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do this. And I think overall, it doesn't really help us to cultivate that mindset. How do you go about practicing and implementing that innovation mindset?
Well, the simplest thing you can do is have a daily practice. I mean, just like, if you're a pianist, what do? I've got 4 daughters who I'm hoping that they will be pianists someday, right? What do they have to do? They have to do their scales. They got to practice. If you're a swimmer, what do? You get in the pool and you swim your laps. Nobody would say, I'm a swimmer. And you go, oh, really? What's your event? Oh, I took swim lessons when I was 4, right? Well, what do you mean? I'm a pianist. Yeah, my parents had me take piano lessons when I was a kid. You have to have a routine practice, a robust daily practice. And so for me, the very, very simplest kind of unit of engagement is I have a daily routine around generating a volume of options before I implement an answer. We call that the daily idea quota. So every single day, generate a volume of options before you choose an answer. And you can design a habit around it if you want, but really the key is shifting your mindset, because the default mindset of every single person is to look for the right answer. The problem is one, very few of us are mathematicians, meaning the problems we're trying to solve don't only have one right answer. And 2, there's no evidence that suggests that the early answers that come into our minds are better than answers that come later. And yet, because of what's called the Einstein effect, this is my favorite cognitive bias. You have to be a real nerd to have a favorite cognitive bias. But my favorite cognitive bias is the Einstein effect, which basically has been demonstrated that when a human being thinks of a solution, they fixate on it and they cease the search for other solutions. Yep. And when you become aware that that's your default mindset or orientation towards problem solving, then what you do is you can actually introduce what Abraham Lutyens back in 1942 called an interrupt. You can say, instead of looking for the right answer, I'm going to shift my goal and try to generate lots of possible answers. And doing that in a mindful way every single day, it starts to reduce the tendency that you were referring to earlier around self-censorship and judgment and things like that.
Many, many moons ago, I left a Fortune 500 company. I went to a pure startup. And so I was the chief revenue officer and I reported to our CEO. And the guy was a lunatic, absolute maniac. But one of the things that he implemented that I thought was absolutely genius was you could never anything you came to him with, the first idea that you had, he would reject. It didn't matter what it was. He would reject it.
Yeah, that's great.
And you had to come in with at least 3 or 4 different solutions to any problem. Like, you could never just come in and bitch about something. You always had to have 3 or 4 different things. But the first one, and you typically led with like what you thought the answer was, he would immediately reject.
Right. That's great. That's great.
It was over time, as we grew from 5 people to 300 people, and you had a whole company doing that, we really were innovating, I think, at a much higher level than most.
It's Sesame Street simple, Scott, but very few people managers think in terms of volume. They don't think about a portfolio,
Right.
taking a portfolio approach. My friend Astro Teller, who runs Google X, he has a tendency to ask for five. So like your insane boss of yesteryear, he asked for five. And I asked him, what happens when you ask for five, Astro? And he said, most teams try to game the system. They have their kind of their pet idea, and then they come up with four dummy ideas because they know I'm going to ask them for five. He said, but what's interesting is many times one of the dummy ideas is better than their actual idea. And actually pushing yourself, that's part of the point. Pushing yourself just to generate alternatives is such a wildly valuable, to me, it's just, the way I liken it, my sister is a really good volleyball player. She kicked my butt in volleyball, despite the fact that I'm older and taller, doesn't matter. She's way better than me. And yes, I resent it. But we go to the grocery store and she grabs a gallon of milk. What does she always do? On the way to the cart, she does gallon milk curls, right? Why? It's because she's an athlete, right? And by the way, many of you probably do the same thing. I do too, right? Or I'll do presses or whatever it is, right? But the point is, to an athlete, every gallon of milk's a dumbbell, right? She doesn't only think about practicing volleyball when she's on the court, when her coach is blowing the whistle, when she's wearing her knee pads, right? To an innovator, every problem's an opportunity. It's, I can do a few curls, right? This is the way to rewire these default biases, but it actually takes attention and intention. And that's where I think a lot of people, and part of what we say about the book is innovation is not an event. And in far too many organizations and in far too many people's lives, they think, when you ask, hey, when's the last time you did innovation or you were participated in innovation? Most people will point to a sprint or a hackathon or a workshop, right? And what does that say? Well, for sure, it tells me that they're not treating innovation like a routine daily practice. It's a moment, it's an episodic activity. And the danger of that is when you say innovation is in this kind of one unique part of the organization or time of year, then the rest of the time it's just do your job, come up with the right answer the first time. And you fail to generate the kinds of novel solutions that actually, as you said, really drive the business forward on a day-to-day basis.
There's so much gold in this book that it's almost hard to figure out where to start. But there were so many interesting things that you talked about. One of them was overcoming dangerous thinking traps.
Yeah.
For anyone who hasn't read the book, unpack that a little bit for everybody.
Well, the way we think has been shaped by pattern recognition and heuristics. We have all sorts of ways we approach the world, and expertise is a really amazing thing, right? As long as the world's not changing. But as we all get online and start playing with Chat GPT, right? As the latest example, the world is changing at an exponentially increasing rate, right? And so increasingly, a knowledge of what's worked in the past is not a good predictor of what's going to work in the future. And so thinking traps or heuristics are often a function of our experience. One of the things we talk about in the book, in one of the later chapters, is around constructing a portfolio of collaborators who have different perspectives. And one of the perspectives that we think is incredibly valuable, just as one way to address one of these thinking traps, is bringing a novice onto your team. We actually learned about this from Harvard. It's a university on the East Coast. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like, they call it the Stanford of the East. But there's a Harvard University professor, Linda Hill, who's an incredible leader and a gifted author. And she leads HBS's leadership initiative. And we were talking with Linda about how she gets to new insights. And one of the things she told us that really floored us was she always has a young person on her team, a 22-year-old or a 23-year-old. She always brings them on her team. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she actually had, just in her background, like I've got a cheesy kind of, book poster, she had a charcoal drawing of an octopus. And she goes, well, like this. And she held it up to the screen. And sure enough, it looks like a child's drawing of an octopus. She goes, the 22-year-old who's on my latest book project, she offered me the octopus as a metaphor for organizational life. Does this make you think of anything? And I mean, set aside the octopus for a second. I was so struck. I mean, this is a world-class management thinker.
Yeah.
Who's got, if you think about this as incredibly precious real estate here, what's one of the things in the window? She's got the charcoal sketch of an octopus that a 22-year-old gave her, right? Just to see if it triggers anything for, a random Stanford professor she's talking to, right?
Yep.
But to me, it's an amazing way of thinking about systematically short-circuiting some of those biases. And for me, I can't help but relish that example, because I know if you think about like Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin's famed institute that developed the stealth bomber, right? Well, where did the stealth bomber come from? It came from a young dude in the back named Dennis Overhauser, who, the advanced and experienced aeronautics engineer said, I got a slide rule older than that kid, right? Who he happened to have free time, right? That's one thing young people have, is that their time is maybe, they think about opportunity cost differently. So he's reading an obscure Russian paper, which, by the way, the Russians hadn't read. And he realizes, wow, it seems like there's a formula here that might give us designs for a lower radar signature aircraft. And it took like 6 months, but Ben Rich gave him the time to do it. And he designed what was internally referred to for a number of months as the hopeless diamond, because nobody thought it could fly. Like, have you seen this thing? It's unstable on 3 axes, right? You can't fly an aircraft that's unstable. And what none of the aeronautics experts, one of them joked, this Overhauser kid should be burned at the stake. Does he know what airplanes should look like, right? Well, what none of them knew was, all of a sudden, computer stabilization was coming into a capability, right? And the fact that an aircraft was unstable on 3 axes actually wasn't as big of a deal as it always had been, right? But the point is, the world's changing. And what experienced people do is they tend to default towards what's worked in the past. And that's a big cognitive trap. And so, I mean, that's one of many that we talk about in the book. But a good question, I feel, I learned this from my father, actually. He's an intellectual property litigator. And he was telling me about a case he was arguing before the Supreme Court. And he said I was telling him about, this young person and Linda Hill's tendency to bring a young person onto her team. And my dad told me, oh yeah, that happens to me all the time. I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, he said, I've got a lawyer who's not 18 months out of law school, doesn't even know where the copy machine is, okay, in the office. And he comes into my office, shuts the door and says, okay, Mr. Utley, either I'm about to say the stupidest thing a lawyer's ever said, or I think I just figured out how we could win this case. And he said, my dad said, that bonehead who doesn't even know where the stapler is found the novel line of reasoning that helped us win the case before the Supreme Court. And I said, Dad, what did you do that enabled a young lawyer to say, I'm comfortable saying what might be the stupidest thing a lawyer's ever said, right? That's a question for a leader, is, when's the last time somebody shared a stupid idea with me?
Yeah.
That's a great question. And by the way, just as an aside, I often find that most leaders have one of 2 answers to this question, both of which are not good. One is never, in which case I'd say, thank you for your honesty. You have work to do. And then the other answer I hear a lot is, all the time. People are always sharing stupid ideas with me, in which case I'd say, you're a jerk and you have work to do. The question is not, do you think their idea is stupid? The question is, do they think their idea is stupid? And that, to me, if you think about how do I create an environment that cultivates innovation, one of the things that there has to be that what Amy Edmondson, another Stanford of the East professor, calls psychological safety, right? There has to be that psychological safety to put unresolved hypotheses out there without being immediately, attacked.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit. So Sarah Blakely's dad, Sarah Blakely from Spanx, her father used to sit her and her brother down at the breakfast table Ford and ask them, what did you fail at today? And it cultivated a very innovative mindset.
That's
one
beautiful.
of the things that I absolutely love, because it just resonated with me, is finding inspiration in unexpected places.
Yes.
A lot of people, when I started something new 8 years ago, they would say, have you looked at this company that's in the talent strategy space? And I'd be like, no, I don't even know who they are. And I'm not interested in trying to mimic what I thought was an antiquated and kind of broken system. And I've
Yeah.
always found inspiration, like I get inspiration from a company called Gray Whale Gin. What the heck does that have to do with talent? A lot. I've learned a lot of different things from very, very unexpected places. Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit more about why that is so important.
This is one of my favorite topics. If I had my druthers and the editor didn't, have the final say,
Right.
I'd put those last 2 chapters of the book first because they're actually my 2 favorite chapters. But the editor's like, hey, you have to have a system first. I go, no, just get to the good stuff. But anyway, that's an aside. But I'm really glad you dove into that. So this word inspiration, I feel like a lot of people, you say inspiration and you either get like eye rolls, right? Oh, that's a artsy fartsy. Oh, you need inspiration, or you kind of you trigger PTSD because you're thinking of those posters in the corporate hallways that like, say courage. It's got like a salmon swimming into a grizzly's mouth, right? It's like inspiration, right? No, that's not what we mean, right? What we mean when we define inspiration, we define it as the disciplined pursuit of unexpected input. And each of those words matter, but I'll just break it down this way. I mean, my wife actually is a fashion designer. She was when we met. I was a financial analyst, okay? Recovering MBA, spreadsheet junkie. I love a good pivot table. And my wife would go to Paris on inspo trips, as she called them, quote unquote inspo. And I can't even say it without smirking, right? Because it just seems so absurd. It's like, this is a boondoggle. You're getting macarons. Just be honest, right? But she'd come back inspired about textiles and patterns and colors and shapes and things like that. And it would fuel her work. And, I met her right about the time that my life got derailed by the D school when I was in business school. And I started to appreciate how the inputs to one's thinking affect the outputs of one's thinking. Okay. It's not rocket science, right? But if you think about imagination is particularly triggered by unexpected information. Particularly. Well, then the question is, how do I stimulate my imagination? I need to expose myself to unexpected information. And that's actually what Michelle was doing when she went to Paris, en Paris, for example, right? 10 years later, just fast forward, because this kind of brought this lesson to a fine point for me. I'm teaching a class with hip hop legend Lecrae, Grammy award-winning hip hop artist. And he and I are teaching a bunch of students at Stanford. And it's, MBAs, engineers, lawyers, doctors, and we're telling them, go get inspiration. And that look on their faces, it's the same, like roll their eyes or just like blank stare. And it was almost, to me, Scott, like I was looking in a mirror, like a time warp mirror at myself 10 years ago when Michelle told me she's going to Paris. And in that moment, I realized, oh, they don't get the value of unexpected input. And I said to Lecrae, what do you think about, he's the unquestioned creative, genius in the room. What do you think about inspiration? And of course, like only a hip hop artist could do, he dropped a bar and he goes, inspiration is a discipline. And I realized in that moment, I hadn't ever articulated in that way. For these students, it's not even on their radar as an option, let alone a routine part of their life. And when you think about the mandate or the responsibility to be solving the new problems that we are facing in our organizations, in our lives, if we don't have routines around getting fresh inputs, is it any wonder we don't have fresh ideas, right? And so for us, and there are a bunch of tools that we talk about in the book that we have used inside organizations, but to be a little bit deliberate and targeted about the pursuit of unexpected input that will trigger new ideas that are relevant to the context.
All right, one last question for me. How do you trick your brain to be more creative?
The best way to do it is to not try to be creative. It's to be obvious. So this is that, and that's a line that I borrow from my good friend Dan Klein, who's the head of the Stanford Improvisers. I can't take credit for it, but by the way, none of us can take credit for anything because we're all just channeling things. I heard a definition of creativity is forgetting where you heard it first, which I love. So, but I try to credit my heroes as much as I possibly can. But what Dan says is in improv, and I've learned a lot from the art of improvisation from folks like Kelly Leonard at Second City and Tina Fey and Dan Klein, is where most teams stumble is they feel like it's their responsibility, it's the individual's responsibility to be creative. And the amazing thing, if you just take for a second the premise that I gave earlier, which is that your imagination is triggered by unexpected input. Well, who's a source of rich unexpected input? It's someone's brain other than my own. And then the question is, in the context of a collaboration, Scott, if you and I are talking and I say, here's the problem, what's the obvious answer to you? You say what's obvious to you, which isn't creative. And you know what happens to my brain, because I come from my own background and experience and set of perspectives. I go, whoa, Scott's super creative. And then the question is, okay, well, how do I respond creatively? And the wrong answer is to think, okay, what's a creative response? The right answer is to take this novel, I'm just picking something up off my desk. This is what Scott gave me. Now, all I need to do is say, what is obvious to me now that I have this new Lego piece in my life? And what's obvious to me in response to this new thing, you know what you say, Scott? You don't go, dude, Jeremy's it was so boring. You go, wow, he's so creative. But all I did was say the obvious thing, right? And if there's a safety in place where both of us have the permission to be obvious, we end up in this kind of spiraling upwards in this wildly creative space, because we're both contributing outside and unexpected pieces to this kind of, Lego creation we're forming together.
I love this topic, and I'm gonna shut my questions down because we've got a long line of people who are anxious to get some knowledge from you. So I think we're starting with Andrew in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Andrew, you're up with Jeremy Utley.
Scott, thank you so much. And Jeremy, thanks for being here. I'm definitely geeking out today on this one.
Love it.
And I would agree. Your book is, as a matter of fact, I'm actually at a charter high school today helping with pitches. And your book is the #1 book that I tell all of the kids at this high school they need to be reading.
Thank you.
Seriously transformative. The question I have for you is if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about tracking idea flow on a corporate level, right? Like, I understand, in terms of my own idea flow and sort of tracking towards that, right? And how you sort of look at psychological safety within an organization. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about, as leaders within organizations or founders or anything of that nature, how to really, track a metric towards idea flow of the individuals in your organization.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. If you, as you probably know, there's simple exercises you can do from the book, right? Like, generate subject lines to an email in a fixed period of time or something like that. I think the bigger thing to me is actually, as much as we harp on volume of ideas, it's actually what I am more attuned to as a leader in my organization is, are folks getting in their practice? And I've actually built, I'd be happy to share it with you if you're curious, but I built a conversational chat bot, so to speak, because I actually need help. As physician heal thyself. I need practice myself. And so what I've done is I used it, Andrew, the other day, I kid you not. I have a house that's built in 1908. My kids, who love to ignore the exhortation to not slam the doors, slam the door for the 1,000th time, as a true dad would say, for the 1,000th time, and shatter this 115-year-old window. Okay, glass everywhere. Question is, what do I do? And the typical kind of way to approach that is, okay, well, we could ground them. We could take away their iPads. Do we talk about grounding them? You run out of answers really quickly. And what I said to my wife, much to her, amusement, and is we should do an idea quota. And we did an idea in that moment, and I have a friend, Bill Pacheco, he teaches at Boston University. Last night, he texted me, hey, we got an issue with my college-age daughter, and my wife and I want to generate some ideas. Would you send me that chat bot? Because we need to do it in isolation from each other for a minute. Point is, when you become aware, you know what I need? I need a volume of solutions. That's a funny anecdote. What I am interested in is someone getting in their practice. And what we started building out, even with this chatbot, is kind of almost an enterprise dashboard, so to speak, where you can see, not in a Big Brother kind of way, but like who's getting in their practice, who's attending to this habit. because those are the people I want to bring into the next, strategic problem solving session. I want to bring in people like, there's a reason that very few organizational sprints result in medals. Most of the time, sprints result in pulled hamstrings. You know why? Because people are showing up with Cheeto stains on their tracksuits. Like, homeboy's, he hasn't tried generating ideas in a year since the last sprint, right? And he just got off his crutches, and you go, let's do it again, right? It's like, is there any wonder we're not meddling here? To me, what I'm looking for is, who are the people who are routinely in the habit of generating bad ideas? Steve Jobs famously said to Johnny Ive every day, as Sir Johnny Ive says, hey, Johnny, you want to hear a dopey idea? He was in the habit and Johnny Ive says most of the time they were pretty terrible, right? But every once in a while, they take the air out of the room and leave us breathless in wonder, right? As only Sir Johnny Ive can say. But the point is, sorry, I won't impersonate him again.
No, that's great.
What I actually care about is who's in the from an organizational perspective, who's attending to the practice. And then I can start to bubble up what kinds of problems are being solved. And wow, if Andrew's regularly practicing, maybe I should toss him one of Jeremy's problems every so, or have Jeremy phone a friend, right? And get Andrew involved, right? But you can start to think about facilitating these connections on the back end of that technology. But so for me, the primary use case or the primary benefit is actually to the individual to routinely interrupt and daily short circuit that tendency to fixate, that cognitive, the Einstein effect. But then on the back end, from an enterprise perspective, as you start to understand who's getting in there, who's doing their reps, who's doing their scales, because those are the people that I want to start maybe pulling into my development pipeline.
Jeremy, that accent made me have to do this. I've got to go to Isabel. Isabel.
Sorry for that. Sorry.
Show them how it's done.
I'm not going to try and show you, Jeremy. I'm really not.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for butchering your lovely accent.
Oh, we love it. I'm not going to try and do any American accent at all, because there is no such thing. As we know, there's about 15 of them.
Isabel, I'm from Texas, and we could talk about an accent if you want.
Well, there you go. So I would like to ask about India. That's the moment I'm interested in. What happened specifically there for you to change your frame on what's next?
Okay, Scott, you didn't tell me people were doing homework on me here. Okay, this is good. So Isabel, thank you.
Around here, Jeremy.
This is great. Wow, we're getting into it. Now, actually, by the way, as an aside, I'm deeply concerned about what questions might come up next. If people are actually doing background, anyway. Thankfully, some of my foolishness was prior to YouTube being invented. There was, as an aside, a time where at a Kanye West and Usher concert back in my youth, there were 60,000 people chanting, "Go white boy, go white boy." And thankfully, YouTube was not a thing yet. So all that say, India is very much inbounds. What happened there, Isabel, was I was working for a startup. I thought I knew what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I was a management consultant and being paid well to do that. And I had a desire in my heart to be involved with economic development, whenever I retired or something, whatever that means. And I had a stint working in Bolivia at a kind of a startup incubator. I had worked in Zambia at an AIDS orphanage, but I had never had much experience in Asia. And so when I was in business school, I thought, okay, I'm going to spend the summer in India working at a high growth startup. And that startup was actually founded on some of the principles that I've had the fortune to be teaching now for the last 13 years around design. And I'm doing, typical MBA spreadsheet stuff, drinking lots of chai, bemoaning when the brownouts run through and the AC in the office turns off and things like that, which was an incredible immersion. But down the hall from me, there are these product designers who they'd be gone for, weeks at a time because they're living in the slums, working among the people that we're seeking to serve, trying to understand their needs and their pain points. And I found myself over the course of the summer just wandering down the hall, like, what are these people doing? And because this is such a radically different approach. I mean, I'm trying to, sign deals and distribution contracts, which aren't insignificant either, but what they're doing is really cool. And they, over the course of the summer, started going, you're kind of D-schooly. And, I would say, you're D-schooly. I thought that was an insult. I didn't know what it meant. It turns out it was a compliment. What they meant was I'm inclined towards a way of viewing the world and interacting with the world that is kind of designerly, unbeknownst to me. And so they encouraged me to attend a class at the D School when I got back to Stanford. It was in the early days of the D School. Wasn't like a well marketed, platform at the time. And so, where the D School's in a double wide trailer on the edge of campus, you got to kind of tromp out there. I remember thinking as a business school student, am I even still on campus? As I went out for the first time, am I going to be kidnapped? What's going to happen here? But it was a really eye-opening experience for me. And I credit the founders of that company. It's called D-Light Design. I credit the founders of that company for cultivating an environment where design and business were had equal seats at the table, so to speak, in terms of the strategy of the organization, where I was enabled to see a better way of solving problems than I had been exposed to before. And that was that was like my first hit, so to speak. And then I had lots of other, epiphany moments, and I try to, share as much as possible in public. So this stuff is documented, but that was the beginning of my life being derailed, as I would say, pleasantly derailed.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Nancy in Rhode Island, you're up with Jeremy.
Give me a minute just to close my door. I'm sorry.
No worries. This must be good. She's got to close the door. Jeremy, I'd be nervous.
I'm sweating. I'm sweating over here.
No, I'm just a glorified HR geek. So I apologize. I work in a publicly private company. So how do you engage innovation in a company that's been entrenched in this the way we've done things, or there's political undercurrents where innovation is needed because we're growing exponentially. We grew from 7 staff less than 10 years ago to 350. We're poised to be 450 staff by the end of the year. And we work in a very niche market with clients with traumatic brain injuries. So how do you engage innovation when the organization's never seen it?
Yeah, one kind of heuristic that I use, as I said earlier, heuristics are dangerous, so take it or leave it because it may not be any good. But I think about managing down, not up, meaning rather than trying to influence some other person's behavior, take the example Scott gave earlier that we referenced about his former boss saying you got to have 5 ideas, right? Or Astro Teller, you got to have 5 ideas. There are 2 ways one can take that, Nancy. I wish my boss asked me for 5 ideas, but I could never do that because, now I got to convince my boss of the value of 5 ideas, right? I would say that's a fool's errand. Or the other way to take it is I'm going to start asking the team that rolls up to me for 5 ideas. I can't control what my boss still wants the right answer. That's great. The way I know I'm going to get there is if I start asking my teams for a volume of possibilities, right? And so thinking about what is your sphere of control, what is your sphere of influence, and starting there. And rather than thinking from like an organizational policy perspective, which may be like an HR bias, but is what does it look like for your team, in a sense, to become a center of excellence? What if you started solving HR problems by working differently? Because most organizations are marketplaces where great ideas and practices start spreading, and people talk about it and start to attribute wins to a different way of working. And so what I might suggest is rather than instituting some new policy, but behaving differently yourself in the context of your team, your sphere of influence, your span of control, and allowing the results to speak for themselves and start to, to spread as a result of the difference to the outcomes that you experience.
Well, thank you, because I'm actually rebuilding my team. My team key player left me on Friday.
Oh, wow.
She did artwork behind me that she knew how much I cared about the OP project, which is what her parting gift to me was the platypus. So now I get to build a team and make that part of who we are.
That's
And
great.
Scott, to your 5 things, I worked in the credit union space for 6 years. I always had to come up with 3 solutions, good, better, best. And I had to have no ego with them. So
Love it.
I'm doing that here as well. Thank you. I've already put your book in my Amazon cart. So I didn't get a chance to read it beforehand. And I'll be sharing with people, and anybody wants to borrow my copy, Scott knows I will happily mail it around the state. So amazing session. Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm now going to build my team the right way with your insight.
Thanks, Nancy. Please let me know how it goes.
I will. You accepted my invite. You were so cool to accept my invite. I love when speakers, Scott, by the way, accept invites beforehand. Like, looking
He's a
forward
cool
to
guy. I mean, we only bring cool people on here. Randy in Florida, you're up.
Quick question. A lot of my family is in your neck of the woods, so I'm curious what you think of the show Silicon Valley.
Randy, you heard me say I have 4 small children. I don't have a TV. What are you talking about?
Have you really not watched it? Seriously?
I've seen a couple episodes, but
How
no, I haven't watched.
outrageously-
It's.
I was just going to
think
say,
it's-
like, a lot of my family's out there, and I asked that question. These are kids at Stanford, and they're very entertained by it. So I figured it was something that you've watched.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to the episodes I've seen. There's a lot of truth to it. Yeah,
All
definitely.
right. Well, enjoy that weather and keep the fires away. Stay safe.
Yeah, right on. Thank you.
Colonel Heathman in Illinois,
Hey.
you're up.
Thank you, Jeremy. It is an absolute pleasure to meet you. I've had fellow pilots who have been through the D school, and I'm just waiting for my chance to come out there as well. So
Cool.
I've had the opportunity to explore this idea of, now I won't call it idea, this element of innovation within the Air Force many times. And we've heard our senior leaders tell airmen, all of us, every airman's an innovator. And while I understand the essence and the championing of that kind of language, it is very confusing, as I've led Air Force bases and had to try to explain, what this is all about, what this means. And one of my tenets in my strategy was driving a culture of innovation, because it wasn't just about establishing an innovation hub on the base, having a 500 square foot room, a 3D printer, and a cool chair, and now we're innovators.
Right.
But that tends to be the idea.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that now even in private industry, that they kind of default to that. Why are some organizations having a tough time with the word innovation in general? And why is there such confusion around that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Scott. And I've really enjoyed the opportunities I've had to work with the armed forces. We did a program with U.S. Space Command a few years ago, which was really in Colorado Springs, Peterson, which was an incredible experience. I think, as we were discussing earlier, the challenge of innovation as event rather than innovation as practice, as individual and organizational capability is part of the culprit here. So if we got to go to the 3D printer room and sit in the cool chair to have really great ideas, then it's a matter of, well, when am I invited into the room, and when do I have an idea worth 3D printing and all that stuff, right? But if you look at really innovative organizations, I would take 2 as an example. You look at Intuit, which is probably one of the best, other than Amazon, perhaps one of the best examples of customer obsession and innovation. That's not the way, my good friend Diego Rodriguez was the chief product officer of Intuit for a number of years. I know Brad Smith, the former CEO, quite well. And they don't approach innovation in that way. It's not an episodic activity. It's not an event. And so I think, one of the things that I have been advocating with leaders, I've got a CEO of a NBA team in the US. Are there, I guess the Raptors, I was going to say, are there NBA teams outside the US? The Raptors. But one of the CEOs of one of these organizations was asking me about, how do I infuse innovation into our DNA? And he and I are, having weekly calls talking about this challenge. And one of the things I think is important is, instead of making it some outside thing, in which case you kind of risk organ rejection, so to speak, by trying to infuse something new, instead starting to name and attribute successes that you have experienced to different ways of working. kind of gets a little bit to the question we were talking about earlier, I think with Nancy. And what I mean by that is this team experienced a national celebrated success recently. And he was telling me, I want to have a happy hour with the sales team to celebrate what they've done. How do I use it as a moment to kind of reinforce? And we basically, I happened to be in Japan recently. And so the kind of subway signs were on my mind. Unexpected input, right? Inspiration. But I basically gave the illustration of, this endpoint, which is a kind of a universally acknowledged innovation and success. I said, okay, if you picture a train line, so to speak, this is the endpoint, and everybody knows we did that great. And now if you think about the future of the train line, you want to take the next hill. The question is, what are the behaviors that you want to reinforce or see replicated? I would put on the train line, as we're debriefing, so to speak, what are the key behaviors, right? One of them was cross-functional collaboration. This is a great example of departments that had never really worked together, working together, right? Another example was there was an enormous volume of, he actually had a 2,000 idea challenge that he had instituted a few months before. And this is one of the ideas that came out. Another thing was there were a bunch of failures. And what we talked about was, if you want the team or the organization to take the next mountain in an innovative way, instead of bringing in some new methodology, codify what we already do. This is who we are. Of course, we cross-functionally collaborate. Did you see what we did at the blankety blank? Of course, we have tons of failures. Did you see the blank and the blank that led to that success, right? And actually codifying that and using moments of success to reinforce the key principles or the behaviors and the mindsets that you hope people leverage moving forward. A lot of times when we tell stories retrospectively, if you hear a founder tell a story, it's like, it can be like manifest destiny. It had to happen this way. It was just a straight line to success. And we all know that's not true in our lives, but painting a realistic picture is really hard to do honestly. And yet that's so important to reinforcing so many of the values of idea flow or an innovation organization in general. And so what I might suggest, I don't know much about your context in particular, but if there are wins, finding ways to attribute, and maybe it's a little bit of inception, maybe it's a little bit of projection, I'll grant you that. But if there are ways to attribute the outcome to the kinds of behaviors that you want to see moving forward, you can make innovation already a part of the DNA rather than it's like a blood transfusion. We need something from outside.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I will validate something you said earlier, that when I moved to my last base, instead of stocking the innovation space or ecosystem with kind of more experienced talent, I stocked it with some of the youngest people on the base. And I tell you, it was remarkable, the changes I saw in idea generation and the volume. So I'm a believer in it. And so I appreciate the book.
One actually, you're making me think of one other thing. I apologize to go. I'm sure, Scott, you have other question askers. Just one simple thing that I think is a key cultural touchstone is since probably the 1960s, there's been an assignment at Stanford, which is very central to innovation, which is keep a bug list. And that's long before computer programming entered common parlance. It's not referring to errors in lines of code. It's referring to one of the fundamental behaviors of an innovator is attending to annoyances. What are the things that bug you? Write them down. And, you hear this phrase sometimes, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. Certainly that's better than bring me solution, as we talked about earlier. But an innovation leader says, bring me problems. Great. I love problems. That's awesome. You know why? Because problem identification is the first step to innovation, right? I want to be commissioning a bunch of airmen who are problem finders, not complainers, by the way. That's not what I mean, right? But people who are attuned, even Jerry Seinfeld, if you hear, he's got a great interview where he talks about, I think Tim Ferriss asked him, where do you get all your jokes? He said, oh, my overly sensitive nature. I'm annoyed at everything, which is great. But by the way, comedy and innovation have a lot in common. Arthur Kessler wrote a great book, which none of us have time to read, called The Act of Creation. I only had the chance to read it because I got COVID before the vaccine. So I had weeks on my back. It's an 800-page book, but he actually compares comedy and innovation, scientific discovery and aesthetic beauty, actually, they all really tie together. But anyway, Seinfeld attends, and he said one of the challenges with wealth, feel bad for him later, is that you can insulate yourself from the difficulties of life. And he said, so the only way a comedian can succeed is you got to have kids, right? Just to make sure you get more difficulties in life. Which is a good joke. But the point is, attending to and cultivating an awareness of problems to be solved is actually a really, I haven't thought about this until right now. But this is just like a spontaneous improvisational innovation, perhaps. You see idea boxes or suggestion boxes. Maybe a step upstream of the suggestion box is the problem box, right? I have no suggestions, but boy, is this annoying to me, right? Why not, right? I think that starts to cultivate. Again, you may not ever do anything with those problems, but for people to become attuned to problems to be solved is the kind of necessary precondition to generating solutions to problems generally. And I don't think that we give problem awareness enough valence in most organizations.
Now, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you added that because that whole clip was absolute gold. All right. We're going to try to sneak in 3. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it. Vikram in Memphis. Then we're going to Yarrow in Florida, and then Frank in Kansas City.
Hey, Jeremy, nice to meet you. I heard you spent some time in India, so I grew up in Mumbai. So I hope you had, I actually make some really good masala chais. If you're ever going to come to Memphis, hit me up. We'll definitely treat you to some good, authentic food. So spent a lot of time in corporate America, in really big Fortune brands. So right now I'm a cybersecurity consultant. And really kind of this whole innovation topic stays near and dear to my heart because I really focus on solving customer problems at the root of everything we do now. And one of the things that you spoke about was innovation cannot be episodic. And I completely agree with that. And one of the things that, I worked at International Paper, which is a Fortune 100 paper and packaging company. And one of the things we started doing and thinking about innovation was first starting to make it episodic, where it started to kind of build into people's culture and DNA. Like in September, we had this huge innovation summit where we would bring in speakers from all across different topics, right? Not just technology, but it could be anything, culture, strategy, whatnot, and started to kind of get people more comfortable and everything and pushed us across the company. We had a tool we could get on and start to put ideas. But I think you hit it where we never really, it still felt episodic for many years. Like we can never get out of that box where, okay, in your daily life and as you do, and as you're interacting and you're operationally doing stuff, right? Like how do you build that innovation on a daily basis, generating ideas? So I just wanted to kind of relay that, sort of that emphasis where how do you make this like when you're waking up, you're brushing your teeth, there's some things you really have to do, right? So from an innovation, how do you build in innovation hygiene? And I think you touched a lot of things in your talk today, but like, are there Jeremy's top 3 things that I can build into my teams? Like, and as I walk in as a leader, like what are the 3 things you would want to sort of tell teams daily as you're walking into the pods, the top 3 things that you could think about that hone in on problem identification, not the solution.
Problem identification. I love that. Your specificity there. One is, when's the last time you talked to a customer? Very simply, right? The other is, what pain are we seeking to address? I think I actually just wrote a blog post on this, maybe last week. If you want a solution to take root and to scale, it's got to address a pain. And yet very few people are clear on what pain they're solving for, right? Or there's, oh yeah, we solve for it in these 50 different ways, right? Rather than this is the one thing we're doing. This is how, so I would say, when's the last time you talked to a customer? What's the pain that we're seeking to address? And then very simply, how do we know if you can, I leverage the scientific method kind of language a lot because there's a lot to experimentation that's valuable. And if you think about a pain statement as a hypothesis, right? A lot of times you don't know whether it's really a pain, what are we doing to validate or invalidate that hypothesis? So say it's a pain, right? Long before you get to a solution, right? So for example, use social media ads, feeling drowsy at work, right? I don't know. I'm just making this up. Right? Well, you have said nothing about your solution, right? But do people click on the ad feeling drowsy at work, right? Oh, wow. Interesting, right? And you just send it to a 404 or just, nothing happens, right? Huh. Wow. When we put that in front of people in this geography at this time of day, we're getting a lot of, or what, I mean, that's a silly example. You can do that with subject lines in an email, right? Open rates. Put a value proposition or a pain statement in a subject line and then just measure open rates, right? You can do that irrespective of your solution's development stage. And you can start to validate, is this a real pain that we've identified? And I think even having some of that hypothesis language helps equip people to be a lot more articulate and specific about actions they could take. Because a lot of times it just remains implicit and anecdotal. And so the target's always moving and everybody's got an excuse or a reason why something didn't work or why something's still outstanding. And if you just put a little bit more structure to the language, you can end up accelerating. You can end up kind of moving much more quickly because you're disqualifying hypotheses and you're invalidating hypotheses, and that's fine. A scientist doesn't care if the answer is no. They have a firm answer, right?
Got it. Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Jeremy, do you have time for these last two, or do you?
Sure.
All
yeah,
right.
let's do it. I love it. Well,
Yarrow, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you. So Nancy brilliantly took my question, how to influence the innovation culture from a maybe non-leadership position. So thank you, Jeremy, for answering that question, as well as all the other brilliance that you've shared. I also want to give a nod to the D School. I read some of Tina Selig's work in the past, and the work that you all are doing as an institution is inspiring. So thank you for that.
Tina's incredible, by the way. Plug, just double clicking on that plug. She's amazing.
She is amazing. As are yourself. So I'm putting you right up there with her.
Oh, wow. I mean, she's Pantheon material. She's like, Mount Rushmore material. So I'm just glad to be in the same conversation.
Right? Okay. So I'm going to adapt my question to, you spoke earlier about kind of the self-talk that we give ourselves of, it might be a stupid question, or I've got one good idea and then maybe some other ones that I'm using as filler. Do you have thoughts or practices to help both ourselves and maybe those that we can influence to not invalidate the questions? Because a lot of the innovation that you've spoken about that I've seen personally comes from maybe those, oh, this would never work space, but it could, because it's thinking outside the box and it's pushing those possible and impossible boundaries. So something that we can do to allow more space for that innovative thinking in ourselves when we have the tendency to discredit where those thoughts are coming from. Please, thanks. I think you're muted.
Oh, is it up to me now?
No, sorry. Sorry, I didn't realize that my microphone was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Well, that was the most important thing I'm going to say all day. So sorry. I'm kidding. I love this question, and it's stimulating something for me that I hadn't thought about. So I hope you all know how much your questions and your perspectives contribute to the discussion. So I think this is actually a really interesting answer. I never would have thought of it if it wasn't for your question, and your question should get equal valence, is what I'm trying to say. So here's what I think is an interesting answer. Why not set a minimum failure threshold? And what I mean by that is, and I learned that actually from a good friend who runs an innovation lab in North America. A lot of times we think about maximum failure ceilings, beyond this level of failure and it's unacceptable. What about below this level of failure is unacceptable? I think there is, the ideal failure threshold for most people is 0, right? 0 defects, right? Well, that's if it's a straightforward task that you already know the right answer to, and it's just a matter of execution. Great. If you grant that you need to be exploring more broadly than you presently are, and exploration, as somebody, I think Isabel dropped a Bezos quote. I'm a big Bezos, fan myself. He said failure and experimentation are inseparable twins. If failure isn't a possibility, it's not an experiment, because then you already know the answer, right? So if you're experimenting, necessarily you will fail. Otherwise, you're not experimenting. And well, then if you take that as a premise, or experimentation as a value or a virtue, and I think actually, Scott, this kind of goes back to some of the stuff you talked about, or that we were talking about a second ago. What's the minimum failure threshold? Like, what does it look like at the end of your meeting to go, none of our projects failed. Absolutely unacceptable. We are clearly not experimenting broadly enough, people. I never want to have such a low failure rate again. I'm embarrassed. I won't even report this to the leadership because it's such a blemish on our ambitions to do new things, right? And to me, I think if you set, and depending on your context, like I have a friend, as I said, who runs an innovation lab, his minimum failure threshold is 60%. Meaning, if they fail less than 60% of the time, he knows they're not exploring broadly enough, right? I'm not saying that's everybody's minimum threshold, but I think questioning your default threshold of 0 is probably a good exercise, right? And if you get to the end of the quarter or the end of the year and you look back and go, we have failed below this amount, and you see that as a failure, which is kind of a meta statement, right? But if you see that as unacceptable, I think that's an enormous step towards the goal that you are describing.
Thank you.
Incredible way to think.
And again, by the way, I wouldn't have thought of that if it wasn't for your question. So we get joint credit for that.
Yarrow, gold star for the day. Frank,
Totally.
you are our cleanup hitter, my friend. Take us home.
Jeremy, you're going to sell a ton of books out of today, so congratulations. This has been really awesome. I wanted to ask you to dive a little deeper. So I get the idea of how this can be fostered in an early stage company, but dive a little deeper into where you have the cultural intransigence of the necessary organizational structures that exist in a not necessarily mature, but an established business, all right? Where people are actively, there's an article in the journal today about this company that saved hundreds of thousands of hours by canceling meetings. And I'm going to try to slow this down and make it concise, but we had in the company that I was with an innovation training, and several things were evident that you mentioned. One is people were intensely uncomfortable with it. People had this was an established company, very heavy science-based. They hated the idea of bringing up bad ideas. They hated the idea of brainstorming, all right? And they saw this as glue in the cogs of the organization. All right. And everybody understood that, hey, we got to be innovative, but we're trying to cut meetings and everybody hates this thing. And so what happens? It died. So, and I think that's more common than not in most organizations, regardless of their cultural makeup and their, the talent of the people. They see this as a time suck. Okay.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate a little bit more on how you can become an infectious agent and just grow this idea rather than impose it from the top down?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a bunch there. I mean, we could talk for the next couple of hours, Frank, but one of the things that I think, one of the myths that you have to dispel is that this is a time-intensive enterprise, right? I mean, I dropped a link. That's the chat bot that I use to deal with my daughters breaking the 115-year-old window. But it takes 3 minutes. It's not, by the way, my wife and I were hemming and hawing for more than 3 minutes in the kitchen trying to figure out what to do before, so it's not like it's any more time, right? And I think for a lot of people, when they think about innovation, they think about the bright and shiny new object, the product or service, the customer facing thing. And then that relegates innovation to a very particular kind of edge case. The truth is that we all need novel solutions to problems that we're facing every day. I mean, I was talking to a president of a global insurance company, a woman who'd been through my program, and she actually, I'll show you. Let me see if I can find this. There's no personal information here, so I'm not betraying any trust. But she sent me this picture, and it's just beautiful because she was telling me, ever since I took your class, I started taking your this daily practice seriously. I started doing it, and oh gosh, where is it? I can't find it. It's not worth it. But she just sent me a picture of her notebook, of her Curious George notebook that she keeps on her front seat of her car. And she said, before I leave the garage every morning, I pull out the Curious George notebook that my granddaughter gave me. And she said, now I'm solving the world's problems in less than a minute a day, And I mention that because it's, and they're her problems. They're not the world's problems, right? They're not always her organizations, but I think one big impediment is when you go, okay, we're going to have an offsite and it's 3 days, if you calculate the time and that's not to say that, equipping and developing and capacity building it does take time, of course, but to say that it always has to take time, or like part of the challenge. And by the way, I'm like world's perpetrator number one as somebody who runs workshops or who ran workshops for a living until recently. I get that people can have the impression that if I want to develop this, it's going to take multiple days at a time, and then if I want to try to replicate it, it takes multiple days at a time, right? I think that the first step is reducing the friction and saying it's less than a minute. It just like, you're a clean person, right, Frank? You go, yeah, I try to be. Yeah. Well, how do you have time to be clean? How in the world do you have so much time? You go, it takes like 10 minutes to shower, right? It's not like the fact that I'm clean does, or you're healthy. Well, how do you have time to be healthy? You mean not drinking the milkshake doesn't actually take any more time. It's just a decision, right? There's a lot of these things when you think about it as a capability, when you think about it as something to which I attend regularly, it doesn't mean, I exercise, but I'm not a triathlete. I don't spend all my time training. I do 10 minutes of HIIT exercise per day. And that's, enough, right? Well, breaking it down to where it's to kind of its component parts and component behaviors, it's not always about this big new initiative that we're launching, this big customer thing, which it can be, that's great. And, we can scale to that size, but it's also, what, I've got this pesky expense reimbursement annoyance. Great. In a minute, what can you do? What I have found, I've done things like this. Especially on the heels of the book, there's been a lot of keynoting and things like that, which is a lot of fun. And I enjoyed doing that. Well, what I'll do, even in the middle of a keynote now, just because it demonstrates the point that we're making here, I'll throw up a QR code and have people do a idea quota on any problem they're facing right now. Do an idea quota. And then I just have people raise their hand. And the first prompt, if you go to that link, is what's the obvious answer in your mind? It's like, what would you do? What's your default answer, right? You put it in. And then there's like a bunch of zany prompts, right? But then I just ask a question, raise your hand if your first idea was the best one. And something like 5% of the room usually raises their hand. Wow. And the other 95% goes, I would have done that first thing. And it's totally fine. But and I only give them 5 minutes, right? In 5 minutes, I'm way more excited about the thing. And all it took was just a little bit of thinking differently, right? I think when you start to break down some of those assumptions around, it's got to take a long time. It's got to require specialized training. It's when you go, no, it doesn't have to take a long time. No, your brain's enough, then you can, and no, it doesn't have to be some huge new initiative. It can just be like the expense reimbursement thing or the broken window or whatever it is, right? Then you start to make it way more practical and accessible. And it's that routine engagement of the muscle that then prepares somebody for the more substantive thing and kind of greases the skids. They go, well, how else could I get new perspective? It's like, interesting question.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Right? But then they start to pull for it because they see the value. Whoa. Like one of the prompts, like, what's your favorite restaurant? People go, McDonald's. Well, how would McDonald's solve your problem? And then you go, wait, if I just thought of a really cool idea because I mashed up my problem with McDonald's, which, by the way, is totally haphazard and random seeming, which it's not entirely, but somewhat. If somebody sees the value in that, which they do, or another prompt is, what's illegal, right? People go, whoa. No, and everybody then goes, I'm not going to break the law, but it was actually really helpful, right? I know you're not going to break the law, right? But you start to realize there are all of these really kind of calcified constraints that we put on our thinking that if you just lift them for a moment, you just practice kind of lifting them, then people start to go, well, how else could I do that? And then you're responding to a pull rather than that imposing a push.
That's excellent. That is excellent. Thank you.
That was a mic drop moment. That was unbelievable. Jeremy, thank you for basically giving us a little bit of a Stanford education in an hour. That was absolutely unbelievable. And thank you for the book. Idea Flow is
my pleasure.
Is one I rarely read books twice, but that's a book that I will definitely read again because I think there's so much wisdom in there. So I can't thank you enough. I know how valuable your time is. And I know we lost a bunch of people along the way, but there's about 600 people that will watch the replay of this in 34 different countries. So I really, really appreciate it. This was awesome.
Thanks everyone for your amazing questions and for your energy. It's super fun to be live doing this with other people. So I tremendously appreciate it.
Love it. Love it. Have a phenomenal day. If anyone wants to stay on for like 5-10 minutes of overtime, I'll hang out. But Jeremy, we really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Stay in touch, please.
Thanks, brother.
All right.
We'll see ya.
Bye.
Bye.